just shared their thoughts. We'll wrap up the member plugins and I'll proceed to introduce our wonderful speaker today, Will Richards. So Will is a rising force in Australia's startup ecosystem, combining strategic communications expertise with hands-on founder experience. Will is a senior associate at strategic communications firm Encour, advising startups and scale-ups, and the founder of Overnight Success. What began as a digital publication has rapidly evolved into a prime startups and VCs resource, data software provider, and investment syndicate, amplifying startup stories while driving real impact in the ecosystem. Alongside this, Will authors Winning Formula, a publication at the intersection of sport and business, and his work has been featured in leading outlets. Please help me welcome Will.
G'day everyone. Thank you so much for that introduction. You sort of told my story for me, which is fantastic. I'd also just like to say I loved that founder, like everyone just sort of like pitching themselves very quickly in front of an audience. I think what you'll hear in this presentation, which will take about 30 minutes, and then we've got some time for some questions as well, is Encour and everything I do at Overnight Success is all about commanding the narrative. So any opportunity for you to grab the microphone and tell people about what you're building, I completely agree. Just like go and put your hand up and say that. We were speaking a little bit earlier about serendipity, and I think serendipity is a beautiful thing. And when you're putting yourself out there in the media, online and social media as well, you sort of know who's in the audience, but you don't know who you're going to connect with. And quite often, when you put yourself out there, it's amazing the doors that open for you. Michael Batko from StartMate has this saying, it's all about increasing the surface area of your luck. So hopefully, one of the things you take away from this presentation is some practical tips on how you can increase the surface area for your own luck. So I'll jump straight into it. So this session is all about how to hack your own comms, and we'll run through a few different things. I suppose what I do want to touch on is Encour itself is a comms agency. We're about 18 months old. We work primarily with startups and scale-ups. And recently quite a few venture capital funds. I'd say our range is somewhere in the realm of like, you've probably raised a seed round. You've probably got like $1 to sort of like $5 million is probably like the smallest startup we work with, all the way up to companies who are on their way to IPO. And then on the VC side of things, it's kind of like you've got some money in the bank, the Fin Review probably wants to hear about it. But before I jump into a bit more about Encour, I wanted to tell a quick story about my journey in startups and maybe why I'm here today giving this talk, because that still feels a little bit weird. So my first job was actually at a startup. I had no idea it was a startup when I got it. I'd never had a job before. It was a telematics car insurance company called Insurance Box. And what that basically did was we recorded the way you drove. And if you were a young driver, so at the time I was 18, I had my license, I went to comparethemarket.com and I got slung with like really expensive premiums. But what this telematics company could do was actually record the way people drove. So you got personalized insurance. And I just worked in sort of like customer service, helping people with their claims, helping people with their policies. That business got bought by QBE. I then worked at QBE for a year. And then the sort of like golden handcuffs from the team that built that original business went back and said, we did a couple things wrong last time. I think we can do it bigger and better this time. So they basically relaunched the same business again with a few mild changes. So I went back and then had my sort of second role in startups. I then sort of went into the world of finance and private equity. I spent 3 years in the sort of space of early education and childcare. And it was there where I sort of like actually discovered, I think, the value of startups, because the bloke I worked for had made a fair bit of money as an angel investor, and he was then investing that in early education, which was a space he was really passionate about. And he gave me this task, which was basically to identify up-and-coming opportunities for him to invest in. And the ones he really wanted to see were early-stage education, childcare businesses that use technology that we could basically invest in as a private fund, or him as an individual, and then be a really useful customer to them, because we had like 50 childcare centres that we could kind of shove it into. So you'd get a bit of money from us, but then you'd also get a heap of revenue. And I was like, sounds great. And I loved doing it because I got to spend a couple hours every Friday going through the news, going through social media and trying to find these little stories and these little founders who were building incredible things. But it was really difficult. The sort of like Australian news landscape is a bit all over the place. There's really good publications, like you've got the Fin Review, the Australian, Sydney Morning Herald, The Age, all those things. But in reality, there's probably only like 6 genuine tech reporters in Australia. And to sort of stay across everything that's happening, you have to be a subscriber to all of those publications. And then you've got the trade presses as well, like Startup Daily, Smart Company. And then you've got social media as well. And it was just this like can of worms that I couldn't quite get my head around. And what ultimately happened was I was missing interesting bits of like interesting tidbits that could lead us to an investment, but I wasn't finding them. And I was just thinking like, why doesn't something exist for people like me who are doing this job? And I sort of worked out a couple tools I could use to make my job a lot easier. And I started basically writing a weekly update to my boss and the team around interesting things happening in startup world that we could invest in. And that was kind of like the foundational layer of what then became Overnight Success. And for those who don't know, Overnight Success has now grown into a digital publication with about 5,000 subscribers. Anyone from sort of very early stage founders through to people who work at Canva and all these other startups, through to the general partners at Blackbird. So I've kind of got subscribers from the whole startup ecosystem, which is really cool. And I saw this opportunity to join the StartMate Media Fellowship. And I felt like I had this business idea of a media business about startups. And I felt like StartMate were the people who would really love that idea. So I felt like if I could pitch this to them and they'd accept me into this fellowship, it was a good idea. But if these people didn't think it was a good idea, it probably wasn't a good idea. But thankfully they accepted me, and that was kind of like the launch of the business. And that's when I started writing it for an external audience for the first time, which was really cool. And along that journey, after about 6 months of publishing it every week, I had probably, I want to say 300 subscribers and a growing but small audience on social media, on like LinkedIn. I got a DM from another gentleman who was setting up an angel syndicate, and he asked me basically to see if I wanted to work for him. And that was the Regional Angel Investor Network. And I said yes, of course. Like I'd love to do angel investment because I love this space. And it wouldn't have happened if I hadn't been creating content and creating things online. He wouldn't have found me. He wouldn't have sort of like seen my passion. So that's like one example of serendipity that you can kind of create for yourself. And then after sort of 3 years of writing Overnight Success and about 1.5 years of doing the angel investment, I was kind of ready for my next challenge. And the sort of insight I've got around PR and comms, which is kind of like an unfair advantage, I guess, is although I work in PR and comms and I pitch journalists, I also get pitched by other comms people because I run a publication that they want their clients to feature in. So I can kind of see what good looks like and what not so good looks like. And I think it kind of like helps me help you guys because I can kind of tell you what is a really good pitch and what makes maybe a not so good pitch. But the reason I kind of joined Encour was at the time I had a podcast, which I want to bring back, which was all about Australian startups. And there was one founder story that grabbed me that week and I wrote about it. It was a company called Slice. And they basically help people pay for emergency travel. And the sort of story around the founder was really interesting and it kind of just grabbed my attention. And I read this article in the Fin Review and I was like, oh, that's a really nice story. And then I looked him up on LinkedIn and I clicked through and he had this like blog post which I read and it was all about his journey and why he founded the business. And basically he was an Indian immigrant, and in that culture, when sometimes things go wrong back at home, you basically have to drop your things, book a flight and go back over. And that can cause a lot of stress for people because buying a flight the week before is really expensive. And it was something that he dealt with and he paid off that debt, but he wanted to solve that problem for more people. So I sort of read this blog post and it was super personal and really beautiful. And I was like, I want to engage with this guy. I want to get him on the podcast and I want to hear his story and have my audience hear his story as well. So we did the podcast recording and it was really cool. And then I got an email afterwards being like, from someone called Jesse Wu, who I knew from the VC world. and she sort of said, "Hey, Will, thanks for interviewing my client. Heard it went really well. Let me know how I can kind of like share these assets and share this recording so it can reach more and more people." And I had a couple of questions. I was like, why is Jessie Wu emailing me about PR stuff? This is sort of the first time that a founder has kind of followed up with this thing. A lot of founders kind of do these recordings and it's kind of like job done. Like it exists online and great. But this was a PR person and a founder who was really keen to basically make the most of that opportunity. So those videos popped off the next day. Like they did their own edit on them. They shared it really well. They wrote really nice like captions for LinkedIn, and it like got me subscribers. So I loved it as a content creator. And then I sort of followed up to Jessie, and I was like, "Hey, I'm sort of looking for my next role. You used to be in the VC space. If you know of anything, like, would love to hear about it, or maybe we can just like grab a coffee." And she was like, "Well, as you know, I've kind of just launched a comms agency. I was just going to freelance, but like maybe you can do some contract work with me because it like, could be a bit of fun while you're sort of looking for your next thing." And that was 18 months ago, and I'm still here. So that's kind of how I sort of moved from, I suppose, like startups, finance, angel investment, and now into comms and PR. And that journey wouldn't have happened if I wasn't writing online every week and publishing and writing on social media. So quickly, some of the clients we've worked with at Encour, you've kind of got your sort of superheroes and your churros. They're quite late stage tech companies. Churros, the sort of like rideshare company that's based out of the US. We were working with them for corporate comms as they were planning an IPO, which unfortunately sort of got switched off. And Superhero as well. We worked with them for a long time around their share trading and superannuation platform. We also did the Crimson announcement. It's a New Zealand-based company that became a unicorn, and that was a really fun project to work on. Sort of one of New Zealand's only unicorns. And then we also had Primary and of course Slice, and Slice I just mentioned before. But Primary was one of our earliest clients who announced their seed round, and I've got a case study at the back around how a very early stage company who they work in sort of treasury management. So let's say you're a startup and you've just raised a bunch of money. These guys were basically saying, "Give us your money. We're going to invest it on your behalf. So instead of it sitting in a 2% bank account, we're going to give you 7%, like 7%. And that can help you maybe hire an extra engineer or an extra marketing campaign or something like that." But to build that amount of trust with a founder as a new business is something quite challenging. So we work with them on work like that. We've also done some work with not-for-profits like Forever Projects. That was a company that I fell in love with. I ended up going to Tanzania to climb Mount Kilimanjaro with some other tech people a few months ago, all to raise money for the orphanage crisis in Tanzania. And in terms of like the media landscape that we've helped land our clients in, it's everything from sort of the tier ones, the Fin Review, Sydney Morning Herald, The Age, through to The Australian, and then you've obviously got your trade press. There's lots of publications that aren't listed here. I think you kind of understand like who is the media. I would say like the Mumbrella and the BNTs, that's very much like comms and marketing trade press. There's great examples of like other trade presses that I think very early stage founders should be conscious of. If you're sort of building in a niche like comms and marketing, their sort of like threshold for what's important in your industry is like a little bit lower than, let's say, the Fin Review, because the Fin Review has just a bit bigger of a bar of what is newsworthy for their audience. So sometimes it's good to think about like, who should I start with first before I get to the bigger end of town? And in terms of like coverage that we've secured for our clients, it's everything from like sort of capital raise announcements, this is the Slice one, through to seed raise announcements, through to op-eds around thought leadership by founders. So why should their business kind of exist, or what's an opinionated take of why this startup has the right to exist? In startup land, it's something we'll touch on a bit later, but you're inherently like disrupting someone. Whether you're disrupting the market or disrupting an incumbent, you're going to be pissing people off. And that's good. Like lean into that. Like you sort of want to be, you want to be the people that are, you want to stand for something basically to make people care, but I'll touch on that a bit later. We've also landed some, this is a PDF, but this is a video from the ABC. So we've landed some quite cool consumer comms. This company is called Adjust, although it looks like just a photo of cars. The company itself is really cool. It's, I think, the best use of AI, which is helping people complain to corporations on your behalf. So instead of you sort of on the phone to Qantas, the AI will do it for you, and they'll sort of get your rewards or get your problem solved on your behalf. So that was a really fun campaign to work on, and the ABC loved it. So just to kind of show there's a heap of different things you can do with comms and PR when you work with Encour. So our perspective on comms is pretty sharp, I would say. Not sharp as in like we're the smartest people in the room, more in the sense that like we want to disrupt. But taking a step back to why are you doing comms in the first place, and this is a good slide to take a photo of. I see a couple of cameras coming up. Every piece of comms you do, whether it's a LinkedIn post, whether it's a tweet, whether it's literally standing up in this room right now and grabbing the microphone and saying what you do, think of the business objective. And there was a couple talks here that were really, really good earlier that I saw around like, oh, I'm looking for developers or I'm looking for this particular thing. So we always think no matter what the company wants or what the announceable is, we always take a step back and think about what is the belief that we're trying to instill in a particular audience to take a particular action to achieve a particular business outcome. So a good example, let's say you're a pre-seed company and you're on that sort of venture capital route. Maybe one of your core audiences for the business to survive is getting more investors on board. So the business objective is more investment because you need to grow and you need to keep growing. So the action you want to instill is to get more capital. So how do you instill a belief that you're a really viable, growing business for them to invest in you? So that's kind of like one of the angles we take to working with like quite an early stage company in the sort of comms that we do. So our perspective on comms itself is, this like keep it simple, stupid, right? Like say something. I've got a press release here I want to read from a privileged position of running a. I won't say who the company is, but this is what happens when I run a publication. So I get pitched all the time. And this is probably one of the most boring pitches I've ever been sent. Let me just get the right one up. So basically, it was from a company, which is quite a late stage company. Here we go. Hi, William. VC-backed company, Australia's digital pre-owned car destination has today announced the appointment of 2 board members. Name of board member, link to their LinkedIn. Name of second board member, link to their LinkedIn, and a brief description of each of the board members. I've copied the press release below. Let me know if you want to chat. I don't want to chat. I don't care. Why do I care about those 2 board members? So the first thing you have to do, and the first thing we have to do as a PR agency, is be interesting. As a founder who's trying to hack your own comms, or as a comms agency trying to work on behalf of your clients, the worst thing you can do to a journalist is be boring. So if you're going to say something that's actually interesting, or say something that actually matters. There's things that happen in your company or things that you will achieve that are definitely newsworthy and definitely tell a story about the economy or your market or your sort of like business, which is great. So use that as like the hook into the story, but then tie it to something that's more interesting. So let's say those 2 board members join the company. I'm not saying that's not news, but reading that headline, like, I don't care. If they were sort of like, how can I sort of make this more interesting? If they were ex-board members from a competitor, or if they were willing to go on record and say really, really sharp things about why they were joining this particular company, that would make it more interesting to me. But right now, it just reads as like, something happened. You can just write about it, and it's not interesting. So the first thing you need to do is the first thing you need to think about is how do you make the message that you're trying to get covered more interesting and more memorable. The second thing is to raise the stakes. So people are inherently tribal, and people are inherently looking for things that actually matter. And basically, when you do anything in comms, you have to put something at stake. And as a very early stage business, and what Slice did that got me over the line was tell a very personal story about if this business doesn't work, if this business isn't able to get off the ground and help people pay off flights to visit their family when something goes wrong, that's a whole community of people that are going to suffer with crushing debt. They're sort of forced. They've maybe come to Australia to live a better life, maybe support their family back home, but because of the sort of forcing function of that particular situation, there's a big group of this community who's sort of, under a lot of debt and under a lot of pressure. So I was kind of like, yeah, this problem should be solved because it sounds pretty horrible. And that's why I was like very keen to chat to the founders of Slice. So always be thinking about like what is at stake if this business succeeds or doesn't succeed. So if you're building in the sleep space, for example, why does that matter? Like why are so many Australians suffering from not getting enough sleep? Let me know as a journalist, or let the journalist know why what you're doing is really important. And then the third one is my favourite, which is your tribe. So your vibe attracts your tribe, and you sort of win friends by alienating curmudgeons. And this is your superpower as a startup, as a disruptor. If you put something at stake, the group of people who you want to have an impact on through your comms are going to rally around you because they know the problem. They've seen the problem. They've suffered from the problem. The way you sort of like get people to rally around what you're building is by building a bridge from your tribe's existing core beliefs. So it's not like you can't just say like you should care about this if you're a particular person, but understand what they care about already and back in that stance. So as a comms agency, we love writing op-eds because you can put an opinion out there that people inherently agree or disagree with. But that opinion that you put out there, make sure it's the opinion that the tribe that you want on your side agrees with. And think about it as well, like let's say you're a startup that's disrupting, let's say you're a sleep startup that's disrupting how people think about sleep. You probably don't really care if energy drinks, energy drink businesses are like affected by your comms or they don't like what you're doing. They're trying to keep people up all night. So you can kind of like make them a target, make them a straw man that you can attack. So that's a example of like we have a particular tribe that we want to love or we want to love us, and then we have a group of people that we don't really care about if they hate us. And that's your superpower as a startup. It's also important to note that as you kind of go through the journey of becoming a more recognizable name, people will put a target on your back. And I mean, when you're a very early stage company, it's pretty ugly for people to punch down on you. So you won't expect it when you're at the early stages of your business. But let's say you're Elon Musk. You either love him or you hate him. And that happens to anyone. I was watching a little documentary on Rory McIlroy, the golfer. And I think you kind of saw that recently at the Ryder Cup. Like the Americans hate that guy, but the Europeans love him and golfers love him, but particular people hate him, and it's because he's successful. So as you kind of go up the ranks in comms and media and become more of a presence, you're going to naturally expect people to show more resistance to you. And that's fine because it's usually people that you don't necessarily care about. Every time I see Elon Musk say something kind of like, he was tweeting yesterday about getting rid of Wikipedia for this new Twitter Wikipedia. And I'm like, that's the worst thing that's ever happened to like social media if we get rid of Wikipedia and we just have like his AI slop version of Wikipedia. But I'm not his target audience. He's trying to get this new group of people, his new sort of Sega fans, to come and love him. So he's perfectly happy that he's caused outrage for people like me because I'll tweet back and the algorithm loves it. So every time you do a piece of comms that's a little bit tribal, you are going to maybe piss some people off, but that's completely fine because they're probably people that you don't care about anyway. But just be tactical with the sort of the fronts that you leave open for attack. You can kind of diffuse those before you actually tell your message, so a reasonable person won't disagree with them. You'll always have crazy people, but the reasonable person, the pub test, if you can kind of close off those exposed flanks with your comms, you're in a good place. So we'll talk now about like how to actually hack your own comms, and I might grab a little drink of water. But there's three types of comms. There's earned, owned, and social. And we'll talk about quickly when to use each one. And we'll start with earned, which is basically when you get a different person to write about your story. So this is when you're in a newspaper, when someone on a podcast talks about you, when, that's basically it really. And the best time to use these publications or use earned media is when you want to show, especially as an early stage company, is when you want to show social proof. So for example, a lot of our early stage companies like Primary, the treasury management platform, they really wanted to be featured in the Fin Review because the Fin Review is a very well-known masthead in the financial circles of Australia, but it's also can be a pretty brutal place. So if the Fin Review is writing about this company in a pretty reasonable way, the people that Primary were trying to sort of impact go, oh, this is pretty legit, the Fin Review's writing about it. We often, back to sort of the business objectives of each piece of comms, we often hear from founders that we're trying to get investment in customers. One of the fourth or fifth reasons is always I want to sort of show to my mum and dad that I'm doing something legitimate. And I think that's a really good example of why the social proof of being featured in a major masthead is so important to particular people because it kind of legitimizes what they're doing. Your parents don't care that you've got 2 mil of ARR. They care that the Fin Review is a little article with a photo of you standing in front of a brick wall that they can put on the fridge and show their friends when they come over. So that's the same thing that happens with your customers as well when they see you under that masthead. The other reasons are sort of when you want mass distribution and when you want to get into different networks, when you want to increase that sort of surface area of luck. So I have a social media following, I'm sure you guys all do as well. They know who you are. You've probably already interacted with them. You maybe have met them once or twice before. When you get into a newspaper, you're sort of getting exposed to a whole different audience that you've maybe never interacted with before, and that's when you create that opportunity for serendipity. The other thing that we love at Encour is when you're in a newspaper, you are basically creating an asset. When you're in any media publication, you're creating an asset which you can then leverage again and again and again in different parts of your business. So e-commerce businesses do this really well. Let's say they get their product featured, whether it's paid or actually earned in certain publications. You go to their homepage the next day and it will say as featured in XYZ, and that's just for social proof. We also think about it from a social perspective. People love on LinkedIn getting around each other and sharing those wins. That's why you see so many founders on LinkedIn, and it can be sometimes a little bit I'm sick of seeing people raise capital when I'm on that journey, and it can be difficult, but the reason they do it is because they've got this social proof thing that they can share that more and more people will get around. So it's this asset that you can then use. There's other things you can do as well, which are sort of to shape the conversation around the industry that you're in. My sort of example of me seeing this work from a personal perspective is about 12 months ago, the ATO released for the first time ever all the companies that had claimed R&D tax benefits. And it's a list of 20,000 entries. Anyone from Atlassian that claim 200 mil worth of R&D down to your mum and dad's shop that claim about $4,000. And I went through this list and I noticed that there were some pretty big claims from gambling companies. And that kind of sat a little bit awkwardly with me because I was thinking, why are the government sort of giving rebates to gambling companies, which are very profitable, to make their products more addictive and better at sort of extracting money from young punters? So I kind of put that list together, put together a bit of a press pack and sent it to a particular journalist who writes for the Rear Window at the Fin Review. And he wrote a pretty scathing commentary on these gambling companies. And I think that started a bit of a debate in Parliament because we saw basically 2 or 3 months later a very quick win for certain politicians to basically say we should save tax by ripping this money out of the gambling sector. And that's actually what happened. So as of this year moving forward, gambling companies can't claim R&D anymore. And I'm not saying that's because of what I did, but I think people do read these publications and they are decision makers, and you can make a difference and you can spark a conversation, which is really interesting. The second is owned, which is when you want to fully control the narrative. So you're seeing a lot on social media right now of people recording podcasts where they basically have a conversation that is not scripted, but it's a very safe environment. It's maybe two founders or a founder and their researcher talking about a particular issue. Sometimes these videos aren't even actual podcasts. They're just people recording like 2-minute clips to then put up on social media. But it's very measured and it's very very deliberate about the message that they're controlling and putting out there. And this is a chance where you can say exactly what you want to say without any sort of no one's asking you a hard question, or you're not in a journalist perspective, in an earned perspective, where sometimes you think you have a really good conversation with a journalist, the story comes out and they've taken a slightly different angle to where you thought they were taking it. So it's a good chance to really own that narrative. And then finally, you've got social media, which is where we find is a really good opportunity to amplify earned and owned media and build parasocial relationships with your audience. So I'll run through these quite quickly because we are sort of brushing up on time, but in terms of how you hack your own earned media, so how you get in front of journalists, we always aim to make sure that your story is timely. So is there a relevant thing happening right now where the piece of news that your company has is actually like interesting to that journalist, particularly like right now? So the adjust thing, for example, that I spoke about a little bit earlier in terms of like complaining to Qantas, the reason we got that ABC feature was Telstra at the time was had a record number of like complaints or something, and people were really pissed off at Telstra, and we used Adjust's data to work out how many customers have been using their particular platform to make complaints to Telstra, and the ABC loved it. So it was the fact, it wasn't because Adjust exists that we got the story landed, it was because something had gone wrong at Telstra. So in terms of like shaping the story, so what makes it newsworthy, is it culturally relevant, and then is it particularly relevant to this journalist? So if you're writing about, in this case, the Tesla outage, we went to the journalist or the ABC news reporter who was already writing about that particular thing to say, hey, we've got this data and we've got this stuff that you can include in one of your stories. And we thought it was initially just going to be like a quote in like the next article, but he was like, oh no, let's do a TV segment. This is really cool. But the reason he cared was because he was already writing about the topic. So in terms of like actually pitching the thing itself, keep it really short. So in terms of the pitch pack itself, we aim to keep it within 2 A4 pages. And that's an opportunity. The way we think about it is the stuff at the top is kind of like your factual things. So these are like the facts of the case. And then the quotes are probably the opportunity where you can like weave a bit of magic on why is this important, or where you can weave in why your startup is sort of like solving this big problem. So the actual dot points, keep them very factual, but then in terms of storytelling, use quotes to tell that story from yourself and other people who have authority to speak on it. In terms of like physically pitching it, you can just shoot it via email. If you have their phone number, send a text. In terms of like what those messages could be, literally just be like, hey, I've got some news. I'm a founder of this. I've got a pitch pack. This is why I think it's interesting to you. Let me know if you'd like to hear more. And they'll basically give you a thumbs up or a thumbs down. If they don't reply, don't worry about it. Just go to the next journalist. In terms of owned media, so here's a few examples of stuff that Encour has put out. So we've had a really good series going on with Lee Jasper, who's a second-time founder. But the important thing here is there's so much crap on social media these days. If you want your owned media to perform in the feed, you have to make it really interesting. And you have to be very thoughtful about how you stop the scroll. I'll talk about that a bit later, but how do you make the start of these own segments really, really engaging? So be distinctive, be entertaining, be educational, be value additive to your particular tribe. And then in terms of actually hacking social media, so I mentioned earlier about how we use social media a lot to basically like double up on the win or have a second lick of the ice cream when we have an earned feature. Again, we're using these assets to stop the scroll and then build parasocial relationships. So Ben Buckingham and Finn, they both work at Primary. So this was the first time they'd kind of like come out and said, hello world, we exist, when they got that Fin Review article. But it wasn't until they posted on LinkedIn and got a heap of engagement and a heap of comments from really high quality people, I guess, that they started getting DMs from potential customers. And I won't say who got into their DMs, but basically a very large private equity firm was like, we should be using your platform. And that kind of like changed the trajectory of that business, which was really exciting. And it wasn't until like the article in the Fin existed, like would that investor have seen that article? Maybe. But it wasn't until he saw them in the feed that he actually like felt compelled to DM them and have that conversation. In terms of case studies, I'll rip through this quite quickly, and I'll probably jump actually to the primary example. So in terms of like what a typical package at Encour would look like and how we think about it from a comms lens, especially when you're an early stage company, is try and put all of your eggs in like the sort of like one marquee announcement basket to try and make it as interesting as possible. When I have sales conversations with early stage founders, the last thing I want to do is like oversell them on what comms can be. And what I'm really trying to get to is like, what's the newsworthy thing that we can use to get you into the newspaper? So for these guys, it was of course their capital raise. So then it was about, yep, sure, we think we can probably get some good news coverage with it. But then how do we make the most of that news coverage as we go? So we got the sort of hero article, which was in the Fin Review. Then we did a secondary reporting sweep as well. So we hit a lot of trade press, which is like Capital Brief and Startup Daily. With those two publications and other trade press, we kind of put together a master press release. And then we think of different angles for different trade presses. So basically, you're not sending the same pitch to 6 different journalists. If you do that over time, you kind of burn relationships because they see the same quotes and the same angles in their competitor, and they start to sort of be like, you're not really giving me anything special, so like I'm going to stop listening to you. And again, the last thing we want to do as a PR firm is be boring. So think of different angles for different trade press, and it'll go a long way. We then amplified it on social media. We then saw a newsjacking opportunity through a different article. So we just got pinged by a journalist. I will say as well, like fame does kind of beget fame. So if you're seen as someone who's got hot takes on LinkedIn, or you're tweeting a lot, or you have written an opinion piece, journalists read those things and they want to engage with you. So we were able to basically slip them in the conversation because David Swan reached out to us and reached out to the founders being like, hey, are you keen to comment on this particular topic? And then finally, we sort of wrapped up that campaign with an in-person event. And because they were trying to build trust in a really sort of like, I guess, financial services industry, which is, give us all your money sort of vibe, they wanted to build actual relationships with their customers. So we used the sort of news article, the social media to then push a lot of people to an in-person event. And then again, borrowed social proof from State Street. So that kind of really legitimized Primary very early on as quite a cool business. I'll stop there because I think I've gone a little bit over time. Do we have time for questions or?
Yes, definitely.
Cool.
Is there anything you wanted to wrap up with, or we're good to move to Q&A?
No, just more
Okay,
case studies.
awesome.
So, yeah,
Give it
all
up to Will,
Yeah,
please,
cool.
everyone. Thank you so much, Will. That was so great. Opening up the floor to questions. Yep.
Yeah, thanks, Will. That's
Pleasure.
really, I'm always inspired by good communicators, because something I'm not. So I really thought that was awesome. Do you have any, is there agencies like yours for startups who haven't got $1 million?
Yeah. I think I would always try to do it yourself initially. I would always advise like the founder to start building that profile themselves, because it will, no matter what, as you grow, help you down the line. I probably would go, if budget was a big concern, there are like very good freelancers that are a little bit cheaper than agencies. So I'd be happy to introduce you to some freelancers that could be of interest, yeah.
Thank you. Yep.
While we wait as well, I would say like, be very conscious. Let's say you've done a fundraise. I sometimes have founders come to me being like, I've raised $1 million, can we do like comms with you? And as an ex-investor, I'm always like, it feels a bit out of whack to spend like almost a percentage point on like a single comms motion. Maybe reduce that a little bit, have like slightly lower expectations and hack it yourself a little bit.
Well,
at the
thank
back
you
here.
for your presentation and just so much passion in the space. Question around speaking to multiple audiences. I've got 3 completely different, intersecting but different ones. General, people with sleep problems in the community, clinicians, and then corporate workplaces. How to kind of, what advice do you give to people early stage around a consistent brand messaging when there are different audiences?
Yeah, so the way we think about it is each of those cohorts is a different tribe that you want to speak to. So we run an exercise where we think about where are the places or what are the things that influence those different tribes. You've probably got the things that your clinicians read is probably very different to the stuff that the general Australian who just wants better sleep reads or engages with. So you can be very specific with the different comms that you send to each one of those things. I would say as well, so the sort of researcher person is probably the trade press angle. Maybe there's some publications you can sort of hit where a lot of people engage with that, or maybe there's events that those sorts of people go to that you can try and interact with. And then for the sort of more everyday Australian person, you could do a general comms like the ABC sort of vibe, or just social media. I would also say as well, you probably don't see a lot of crossover with, the researchers and clinicians are also everyday Australians, but when you think about it from a Venn diagram, they might not be that much crossover with the messages each of those groups receive. So you can be very precise in those cases of hit them with this key message and then hit those people with quite a different key message.
Hi Will, it's David from Alumni. First of all, thank you for covering Alumni when we raised our capital rounds on
Pleasure.
Success. Question about the mastheads versus the journalists, because you mentioned a lot about mastheads themselves, but there's certain journalists within those mastheads that cover certain topics. And so what's your opinion on being focused on a masthead versus focus on journalists who cover particular topics, like AFR, for example?
Yep.
There's a lady that covers education and there's a lady that covers workforce. 2 different people with 2 different audiences. And if I've got a business that sort of traverses both, how do you sort of manage that?
Yeah, so each of those journalists is a beat reporter, so they write to a particular beat. So in terms of the Fin Review, a good way of thinking about what does the Fin write about, they have 3 primary things, which is how do we help people make money, how do we help people protect from not losing money, and then how do we help people get a better job. That's kind of the 3 things that the Fin Review wants to write about from a very top-down perspective. And then there's also just the news of the day sort of thing. And then within that you've got the different beats. So then you've got careers or work or whatever. I would say think quite deeply and do a lot of research on what are the particular things that journalist has written about, and use those as a way into different pitches from your startup. So you can kind of be this journalist really wants to cover stuff around this particular thing. I can definitely pitch an angle that's relevant to that, and then that journalist wants to do different stuff. So you can be quite specific with what goes to each person. Yeah, I would do it one by one. I wouldn't send them both an email at the same time. I would probably start with who you think is the best chance, and then sometimes what we do see is we get referred by journalists to other journalists, where sometimes the journalist will be oh, I'm really busy this week, I've got a couple of stories, but you should definitely speak to this journalist because they're looking for a story. So sometimes they'll pass you to, if the story's good, they'll pass you to the next relevant journalist who wants to cover something. That you can get quite lucky sometimes where a journalist just doesn't have a story for that day, and maybe it's something that wasn't super newsworthy, but you can just sort of make the most of it. Yeah.
Thank you. Got a question here?
Is there any point going straight to the editor, or should you not do that?
Depends on how big the story is. I think I'd probably start with building a relationship with the individual journalist as well. That's something I probably didn't cover too much in this, but you can kind of be useful to a journalist before you've got the sort of major news announcement. So if you're in a particular beat, just start speaking to that journalist, or start just trying to provide a little bit of value to them when you can, or just make an introduction, and they'll have a list, the Rolodex of people that they sort of want to speak to or who they could speak to down the line, and then you can just send them a message. But yeah, I'd probably try hit the individual journalist first before the editor.
Awesome. I've got a question from us. So with earlier stage founders taking a few steps back from like PR and media visibility, what are your thoughts on building thought leadership, especially when early stage founders are still ideating, building, they don't know what their product exactly looks like or who their customers really are? What kind of angle, what are they holding on to in their communications?
Yeah, I think when you're very early on, what you're trying to do is like bring people. You're trying to build your tribe, right? So no matter if you don't know the exact business you're building, you probably have an idea of like the problem set that you're trying to like solve for, or like the industry that you're trying to solve in. So I would just sort of recommend start trying to add value to that sort of industry. What that could look like is, is there a research report that you can do a bit of thinking over, do a bit of research in, and you just create like a bit of a tidbit post about like that particular research report. People love that. I would definitely advise don't just like go to AI, ChatGPT, and just type in like, hey, give me some thought leadership on like X, Y, and Z, because that's horrible, and no one wants to read that, and that's what everyone else is doing. So like think of how you as a person of authority can comment on a particular thing. So if there is a research report, what is your take on this research and what it means for that industry? And that's a good way of like building a reputation. It's what I did at Overnight Success for 3 years when you don't have a reputation at all. So I was just providing value to a community based off nothing. I was just sort of aggregating news.
And that could also then generate demand and get people potentially to sign up to a newsletter or just taking them on that journey.
Yep.
Many early stage founders are doing a lot of customer research, interviews. They are gathering a lot of insights. So would you recommend maybe transparency with sharing insights through, thought leadership through sharing insights across the problem and potential solution?
Yeah, I mean, like exactly right. Like, what's your unique perspective on stuff that's going on in your industry? So if you've had 100 conversations about a particular thing, like share those insights with people. Like that's really interesting because not many people have 100 conversations with 100 different people about a particular thing. So you can pull some strings together and have like an interesting opinion and a take that actually adds value to a particular sector.
Thank you. One last question. Yes.
Last year, AAP picked up an exhibition that I had on the beachfront at Bondi Beach, which was a first sort of coming out of the project. AAP ran it through 70 regional outlets, from Perth to the Canberra Times to lots of regionals. Yep. But the problem was our target region was actually Queensland. Queensland ran nothing, except the Mount Isa North Star, which is really, really ironic for a number of reasons that I won't go into.
Yeah.
But how do you get around that?
Yeah, I mean, what you have got there is what we do love when you get syndicated across a bunch of different publications is you've kind of got like 10 for 1. Basically, because you've got all these different mastheads that have covered your thing. So that's like a lot of social proof that is interesting. Whether they're people who are in Queensland who, like, if I go to a website and I see like there's 10 different mastheads have written about a particular thing, I'm like, oh, like this is like fairly legit. Like they've been covered by all these different publications. So I would definitely like still use those even though they're not particularly relevant to like your geography. But I think you can think about like, okay, what's the angle for the geography that you care about? So like how does what you do matter to those people and a particular journalist in that space? And you can use those publications as like an angle in. So like, oh, we got covered previously for this. We're actually doing it again in this region. Like would love to have a chat about like what that means for the community. What do you mean? Oh, so you think it's literally just because of the bias of, yeah. Yeah, I mean, well, maybe that's the curmudgeon that you can alienate. Like, think about other publications that would be happy to, because potentially the people that you want to actually be on your side don't read Murdoch papers.
Yeah, and they definitely would exist.
Yeah.
One very last bit from us, just planning. So should early stage founders have a media strategy, plan a media strategy? And is there a directory of journalists or media outlets that they can sort of go and find and kind of make a list of?
I think when you're a very early stage, what you don't want to do is like scoop yourself. So like if you have raised money, like that's fantastic, but like don't just like chuck that on LinkedIn. Like that's ammunition you can use for a potential media release down the line. So be very tactical about like when you announce things. So Primary, for example, I've spoken about them a couple of times, but they'd raised their money 6 months before they kind of went loud with it. They waited so long because their product wasn't ready yet. So they waited until they had a product that they could like sell and some case studies that they could like talk to before they went live with it. So I think be very thoughtful about when you do go loud with what you're doing. In terms of like the contact database, like there are tools that have journalist contact details. To be honest, I think the old school way is a little bit better, where you actually spend the time to research and find who are the journalists that are really relevant to your space, because you actually read their stuff. You can actually have a conversation with that journalist about what you're building. So don't just like download a spreadsheet with 600 emails and then put that in a big CC or BCC thing and like fling out a thing. Like be very precise with what you're doing, because you only kind of have one shot.
Amazing. We'll wrap it up. Thank you. Thanks, Will, again.
All right, thank you.
And thank you all for coming in today.